The King's Indian is primarily a reply to the Queen's pawn opening, so it occurs after the moves pawn to d4, knight f6, pawn c4, pawn g6, knight c3, and now just the simple move bishop to g7. This is the proper starting point of the opening known as the King's Indian defense. But I do want to point out that this simple setup by black, fianchettoing the bishop and developing the knight, this can be used also against the English, saying if white would have opened up with pawn to c4 or knight f3. So black can use this setup against a number of opening moves, and this is one of the selling points of this opening. Most games in the King's Indian continue with white building upon his space advantage with pawn to e4. And black replies pawn to d6, aiming to avoid an early e4 to e5 by white. Now, what's so unique about this setup for both sides? With this setup, black has turned his back on one of the major principles of the opening play, which is that you should generally try to establish one or maybe two pawns in the center. In this position, black has not placed any pawns in the center, and in fact, he's allowed white a full occupation there. However, he's banking on the fact here that he's achieved his development rapidly. He's already very close to castling kingside, whereas white has a long ways to go. And secondly, he's hoping to eventually launch an effective counter strategy against the center. To help with this, he's already poised his bishop on g7 against the sensitive point 4. White has a few major ways of continuing in this position. In today's video, we're going to deal with the most radical and aggressive move here, which goes pawn to f4, leading to what's known as the 4 pawns attack. White sets a ferocious pawn front here and threatens to literally blow black off the board with an eventual e4 to e5 or f4 to f5. But surprisingly, of white's 3 options at move 5, this one has the weakest reputation, as white is continuing to kind of fall behind in development here, and he's continuing to leave some squares vulnerable to attack, especially this square on d4. By studying black's method of playing against the 4 pawns attack, we'll begin to gain insight into black's strategy as a whole in the King's Indian defense. In this position, black, surprisingly, just castles normally here. Black knows that it would be premature for white to play pawn to e5 in this position here without yet having developed any of his pieces to support it. So now black could simply capture, for example, d takes e5, f takes e5, knight e8, and black is ready to strike in the center with this move pawn to c5. And this just really doesn't seem to lead anywhere for white. So instead he plays knight to f3, finally continuing some development and maybe making this threat to play e5 stronger. Now, black has completed the most obvious aspects of his development in this position. He's got his king castled and he's completed the fianchetto here. And it's time to launch an effective counter-strike against white's most sensitive point. And in this position, that's going to be the d4 point. So black has 2 ways to try to deliver a 1-2 punch here and demonstrate that white's center is overextended. The first way for black to go about delivering a 1-2 punch in this position would be pawn to c5, attacking d4. And now after d5, he delivers the second blow, pawn to e6. And the idea of this setup is just to play pawn takes d5 at some point. Let's imagine that it's black's move. Pawn takes d5, pawn takes pawn, and now to target the e4 pawn. So black shifts from attacking d4 to attacking e4 and vigorously develops his pieces and his counterplay in this way. Now, of course, white has his own move here, and depending on what he plays, the play can take on a different character. But black has a more modern and potentially a more difficult 1-2 punch for white to handle. And this is to start with this seemingly innocent move, knight to a6. And now after bishop e2, he delivers the second blow, pawn to e5. Now, with this setup, black is so confident in the weaknesses which are going to be left behind in white's position that he's willing to give up a pawn to destroy the center. Notice that in both cases, black is attacking this sensitive d4 point, and that's how he's beginning his attack in these positions. The goal here is to force the pawn on d4 to either trade itself off or move itself to d5. And in both cases, this allows black to gain stability on the dark squares, and then to complete his development more easily since he'll always know what the pawn structure is going to be defined as. In this position, in this particular position, we're going to see this attack on d4 carried out in a tactical fashion. So let's focus on this very tactical idea, knight a6 followed by pawn to e5. Now, knight a6 did look like an innocent move, but in fact, it is one of the many ways black can typically deploy the queen's knight in the king's Indian. Black is hoping that after he later undermines the center with this move pawn to e5, that he'll gain a strong square for his knight on the c5 square. Then he will use this as the basics for an attack on the e4 point in the center. An example of this occurs after bishop to e2 and pawn to e5. And we'll explain in a moment what happens if white tries to win a pawn by capturing twice on e5. But first, I want to show this key motif of bringing the knight to c5. After one of the main continuations, f pawn captures on e5, pawn takes pawn, and now pawn to d5, black would play knight to c5 with a big attack on the e4 pawn. A big secret in the king's Indian is that although black's attack begins on the dark squares, particularly against this d4 point, it turns out that he often uses the stability which he gains on the dark squares to transfer his attack to the light squares, particularly on e4. And so we see this in this position, that black is now attacking from the dark squares onto this light square e4. And it actually turns out that because white falls so far behind in development in the four pawns attack, it turns out that black's attack on e4 already has to be taken very seriously. For example, if white made the slightest misstep here, a very easy move to make here would be queen to c2. But now black would have a crushing blow, knight f takes e4. And now after knight takes e4, bishop to f5, bishop d3. Black can recover his piece with simply bishop takes e4, bishop takes e4, and pawn to f5. And this variation shows the enormous risk which white is taking by pushing so many pawns in the king's Indian, and just how quickly, especially in the four pawns attack, that black's attack can very quickly become revolutionary. And in this case, we were able to make a sacrifice on e4 and recover the piece very quickly, and black has a better position. Of course, I don't want to create the impression that this is what has to happen to white in the four pawns attack. The four pawns attack is sound and shouldn't lead to a disadvantage for white by any means. Instead of queen c2, for example, white can get a decent position with the move bishop to g5, though black is also doing quite nicely in this position as well. You're probably wondering what happens if white tries to go up a pawn. For example, what if he plays a pawn takes pawn on e5 instead of this move pawn to d5? In this case, black would easily regain his pawn by simply playing queen takes queen, and bishop takes, and now knight g4 with an attack on e5. And it wouldn't be possible for white to hold on to this pawn for very long. But a more testing idea, which white could use, would be maybe knight takes e5. Here, black is still able to continue his assault on the center with the move pawn to c5, totally busting up white's picture-perfect life in the center and damaging his pawns. Of course, white would like to play pawn to d5 here, but, well, there's knight takes e4. So, because of this, white generally plays bishop e3, pawn takes pawn, and bishop takes pawn, trying to hold on to this knight and hold on to this extra pawn in this position. But the knight on e5 is very shaky, and also the pawn on e4 is very shaky in this position. Theory shows that though the position is a little bit tricky, it's approximately equal with chances for both sides. This concludes the variations which I wanted to show for today. Through this look at the four pawns attack, we've started to gain some real insight into the king's Indian as a whole, and we've begun to understand some of the key strategic ideas. Black usually, first of all, stages his counterattack against the dark squares, and then shifts to trying to put pressure on the center as a whole in order to gain counter chances. With the four pawns attack, I think black's chances of equality are very high, but There are some other dangerous attacking ideas for white in the King's Indian, which we'll take a look at in other videos. That's all for today, and we'll see you soon.